And joining us now on the debate in Frankfurt, Germany, via Skype, Amy Allen, professor of philosophy and women's and gender studies at Dartmouth College. In Ithaca, New York, Meredith Small, professor of anthropology at Cornell University. And with us here in studio, Allison Schaefer, psychotherapist and parent educator. And Allison, it's good to have you back here. It's been many years. To our two guests on the line, we're happy to have you with us as well. I want to start by reading this excerpt from something called The Conflict. The concept of a good mother did not exist in France. Most mothers balk at the idea of giving up work, even in the first year of their child's life, and most of them bottle feed. Public events like La Lèche League's Big Nurse-Ins, held in big cities to encourage breastfeeding, mostly draw smiles, shrugs, and sarcasm. Let's get into this. Amy Allen, start us off if you would. What has led to this latest rendition of the so-called mummy wars?
Well, I think that's a great question. One of the things that's so interesting about Badinter's book is the way that she talks about differences in styles of parenting in different parts of Europe and with the United States. So she makes a big comparison between France and Germany, where I'm currently staying, and the United States, and claims that the kind of over-involved helicopter parenting that we find to be quite common in the U.S. has never taken hold in France, and that this has been good overall for the equality of women.
How would you answer that, Meredith Small, this latest rendition of the mummy wars? Where's it coming from?
Well, it's not just in Western culture. I think you can compare Western culture to other places around the world. And it is interesting that everybody seems to have an opinion how to parent, especially among women, and that there's a lot of approval and disapproval depending on where you stand. And personally, as an anthropologist, I put a lot of this down to the fact that there's a major decrease in the birth rate in Western culture. And when you have fewer children, you have more time to worry about how you're bringing them up. As one of four, I can say my mother never paid much attention at all, and she certainly didn't have a philosophy about parenting. But we sure do in Western culture now.
Meredith, it's so nice to see that you've gotten over the fact that your mother didn't give you any attention.
I seem to do okay,
You seem to have done okay. Yes, you have. Okay, Allison, you want to weigh in on this?
Absolutely. I mean, we had a cultural tradition of parenting in North America that was very hierarchical. It was very punishment-based. And we decided with 100 years of research on self-esteem and child development and attachment that we better erode and decay that system. And what I believe we're seeing is the pendulum has swung, as it does usually with social change, to the far extreme, where we're getting now the pampering and the helicopter parenting. And now the product of that parenting is actually failing to launch, and we're seeing the selfishness of today's youth. And so now finally we're looking at North American culture and saying, I don't think you guys are doing it so great. You know, you have this, as a culture, we have a sort of superior attitude on the world stage, and apparently we're really baffling up parenting. I think everybody else is sort of pleased to point out our faults.
Let me follow up with Amy on that, because Allison, you said it and Allison just reiterated it. It's a North American phenomenon that we're talking about. They don't seem to do this kind of smothering or helicopter parenting in Europe. First of all, tell us why you're over there in Germany to begin with, Amy, and then after that, explain to us why this doesn't seem to happen as much in Europe as it does over here.
Well, I'm in Germany right now doing a research fellowship, a Humboldt fellowship at the University of Frankfurt. So that's why I'm here for the semester. And I think, actually in different parts of Europe, parenting is there are very different styles of parenting. So France and Germany, which are very close geographically, have very different styles and cultures of parenting. And part of that probably has to do with their cultural traditions and so on. And part of it has to do with institutions. So in France, there's great state-funded childcare available from infancy, essentially, on. And Germany has instead offered a lot of support for mothers, but it's primarily in the form of institutional support for mothers who want to stay home. And so as a result, there are fewer, I think, relatively speaking, working professional women in Germany than in France.
And Meredith, why is it that parents who do smother their kids or are just hovering the helicopter parent type, Why do they not appreciate or realize the fact that they're really being gross?
I think that we're in an era, as both the guests have already talked about, we have deep ideology about how we bring up our children. It's kind of interesting that our belief systems are played out in parenting. And if you compare, say, any of Western culture, be it France, Germany, Italy, America, Canada, whatever, what we see, if you compare that to developing nations, or let's say hunters and gatherers, that we have an ideology in this country that children are burdens, they're not assets. But if you come from a culture in which children very quickly contribute to the maintenance of the household, let's say the kids are tending livestock, or they're taking care of other children, or they're weeding gardens, parents are not investing as much in terms of time and money and energy. But in our culture now, kids don't have to work. They don't, at least for middle and upper class kids, they don't have to contribute to the household unless the parents make them do chores. And so the children have become more of a burden, and we seem to, as one guest pointed out, we seem to be extending that even further. Education costs a lot, after school programs cost a lot, and so parents work even more to get the money to afford these things for their children, assuming in an ideological sense that that's going to turn out a better citizen. And of course, we don't even know if that's true.
Now that's a fascinating observation, and because you're here in Ontario, I want to ask you about our Premier. Dalton McGuinty
Yes.
frequently tells his audiences he's one of 10 children, and how much they had to, as kids, obviously pull together and work together in order to make the house work. No one talks that way anymore, right? When you're one of 10 kids, you got to do that. You can't be a burden, you've got to be an asset, right?
Absolutely, and I totally agree with what Meredith is saying, that now we are waiting longer for the onset of childbirthing years, right? We put ourselves through our education, so we're not really starting our families until we're at the end of our reproductive years. So now, if you look at any species, if you're a salmon and you're just spraying seeds all over a riverbed, you don't really look after your young. But if you're an elephant and you only have one every 8 years, you really spend a lot of time investing in making sure your little genetic pool is going to live and survive. So when you're one of 10 and everyone's working on the farm, it's free labor. But now we are in a child-centered culture that exalts the child. And so if you only have one, it's the way we used to have trophy wives. Now we have trophy children. And you are going to invest your time making sure that they are educated and that they are enriched. My goodness, never have leisure time. That's wasted time. You could be improving yourself and getting yourself ahead in life. And there's a real scarcity mentality. We're telling people there isn't room for all citizens, only elite citizens. So your kids better be educated. They better have that leading edge. And that was not the day when you were one of 10 and there was work for everyone. There's enough corn and tomatoes to pick for everybody on the farm. And in fact, you're free labor. It doesn't cost anything to give birth to a child. Have more, have many. It's a completely different system now.
But this only works, this philosophy only works if you've got 1 or 2 kids, right? Once you start to get higher up, and obviously at 10, it's a whole different philosophy, right?
You cannot give individual attention to 10 kids,
right.
And so that does not mean those kids are loved less. It means that you do not have the ability to do the helicopter parenting and the pampering, which I would agree we found is as psychologically hurtful to kids as neglect or abuse.
Amy, I read something where it said that women back in the day who might have had 5, 6, 7 kids, used something called a playpen, and that was okay. But nowadays, if you put 3 or 4 of your kids in a playpen at once, Children's Aid to be on the phone saying you're abusing them. What's going on?
Well, I'll confess that I have 4 children myself, and so I have used the playpen many times, and I don't see any problem with it.
I'm calling Children's Aid right now, Amy. Sorry about that. Yeah.
I wanted to add one thing, though, which is, because I agree very much with what Meredith and Allison were saying, but I think there's another sense in which a kind of economic situation is playing into this recent, flaring up of the mommy wars in terms of a cross-cultural comparison. And that is that, I think that a lot of this is the result of the fact that women entering the workforce in the U.S. in such large numbers over the last 30 or 40 years has just been a huge shift, and that we haven't yet figured out as a culture how to make sense of that and accommodate it. And I also think that at the beginning of the 21st century, there are real worries and fears and anxieties about America potentially being on the decline economically and historically, and that this is feeding into a lot of the self-critical discussions of American parenting and looking at other cultures and saying they know how to do it better than we do.
But Meredith, my hunch is, my sense of it is this time it's different. It's not just sort of stay-at-home moms versus get out in the workforce moms. It's not just pro-breastfeeding versus anti-breastfeeding. It's almost, you know, our way of life. Our country does it better than your country. This seems much more international in scale. Is that right?
I think that's absolutely true. But I think it's also true for other cultures. If you go to any culture around the world and talk to them about parenting, every culture believes they're doing it correctly. Everyone does. And so the differences seem to be highlighted. What is different, I think, in Western culture is the scorn, is the disapproval that is actually quite public. And it actually happened to me recently, where someone was presenting their ideas of parenting about their 9-month-old, and I had to stop myself from rolling my eyes. So it comes in both ways. I also wanted to add in here another part of the change is the introduction of good, decent birth control. If you look in the 1960s and 70s, this is when women got access to the birth control pill. And so having a baby has become more of a choice than it used to be, say, in any time previous to that. And that is a major sociological change for Western culture.
I can't believe that we're actually, 6 or 7 minutes into this discussion, and I haven't yet brought up the cover of Time, so I'm going to do it now.
Yes.
Because that just got such attention. And I want to know, there it is right there, are you mom enough? Allison, the audience that you write for and, you know, who react to the stuff that you do, what did they think of that?
To the cover or to my comments about the cover?
Well, let's start with the cover and then
well,
then your
the cover
reaction.
was meant to be inflammatory, and most of the moms that I speak to are quite educated, and I think they felt it was meant to be provocative, and you made it provocative, and they thought it was sort of a media play, to tell you the truth, because they are quite smart and savvy. So to put a very thin, young mother with nubile breasts on the cover, and just to use the words mom enough, I mean, right there, that's a poker right at you there. But then the article didn't even reflect what the cover had to say anyway.
Imagine
so that was like a whole other, I guess you really just wanted this to get picked up, you know, and thrown in grocery carts. So they had that conversation. But I did write a piece about attachment parenting and about us going too far in our worries about children being psychologically fragile, which is, I think, another one of the phenomena that adds to this tsunami that's leading to these mummy wars in its current state. And that I put out to parents that I think kids are actually much more robust than North American culture would give them credit for. And I think that is playing into this, and that our worry that if we do anything that strains the child psychically, that we're going to somehow break this attachment, we're going to hurt the bond, psychologically damage them, is the biggest worry that is stopping us from being firm and friendly, setting limits, going back to work, and some of these other decisions that we're making.
I have no idea, Amy, if that child actually belonged to that supermodel.
Yes, and that child was almost 4.
Does.
They did talk about the cover story and that shooting.
That kid really belongs to that woman?
Yeah, that's really her breastfeeding her child.
Okay, in which case, I want some feedback on this. Amy, do you think being on that cover has doomed that child to a life of ridicule?
Oh, well, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I wouldn't think so, because I think, of course, it depends a lot what social and economic circles you move in, but it seems to me that this kind of style of attachment parenting has become, within certain circles, very acceptable. So, you know, I mean, I think outside of that particular, you know, context, perhaps, but I don't think that it's even that unusual. I mean, certainly 3 years old is outside of the norm for how long people breastfeed, but it's not unheard of in certain kinds of contexts at this point.
No, I hear you, but Meredith, let me get you to weigh in on this as well. There are some people for whom a child of that age, that's just crossing the line. And the look on that kid's face, I don't know if we can bring that up again, but the look on that kid's face is actually quite intriguing and bears some further study. And I want to know whether you think being on the cover of a magazine like that could damage that kid in years to come.
Well, it depends on what the parents do with the magazine cover, if they're going to frame it or they're just going to put it in the bottom of their bird cage or wrap a trout in it. I don't know. But in terms of length of breastfeeding, if you look across cultures, there's a wide range to weaning for kids. And hunters and gatherers certainly are breastfeeding up to 4 years, and it provides a birth control because women stop ovulating. And that's why you have a long interbirth interval in those cultures between children. And we have a very short interbirth interval, and that's why. So I think what's really different about Western culture is that the length to breastfeeding on average is very short. I think it's about 4 months now. Only about half the women leave the hospital breastfeeding. Very different from the cultures where, in fact, most babies are being born, where everybody's breastfeeding, and they're doing it for at least a year, if not longer. But at the same time, we can't even judge that because around cultures, women always they always supplement breast milk with some kind of solid food, and they do it very quickly. So we even have sort of an odd view of breastfeeding, that it should be exclusive, that it should even happen in intervals rather than all the time as it is in other cultures. So the mommy wars could even be much more extreme if we looked cross-culturally.
Understood. I started the program by reading an excerpt from The Conflict, and now I want to read another one. This is from Bringing Up Bebe by Pamela Druckerman. I'm hardly the first to point out that middle-class America, she writes, has a parenting problem. In hundreds of books and articles, this problem has been painstakingly diagnosed, critiqued, and named. Overparenting, hyperparenting, helicopter parenting, and my personal favorite, the kindergarchy. One writer defines the problem as, quote, simply paying more attention to the upbringing of children than can possibly be good for them. Okay, Allison, let's get into that. You agree?
Yes. And I read her book. I loved her book. I thought it was great. I did. And it was a night. I think what was so great about that book was that it came on the heels of the Tiger Mama, who was saying, see, you Americans, you're screwing it all up. Let's go back to the old, iron-fisted way. And so what I call it's like whack-a-mole parenting. The kid rises its head up, you whack them down again. They rise up, you whack them down again. It doesn't have to be an either-or. Pamela Druckerman talks about the French model as being something that I think North Americans would probably find palatable, in that it's asking us to back off a little bit, have more faith in our kids, trust our children more, to respect ourselves more, and so I think that message is just the right flavor that I think that will get some improvements.
Well, I hear you, but then we talked earlier about having a large number of children as, or a small number now as being part of the explanation behind this. My bet is that after what happened in this city over the weekend,
yes,
with a murder at the #1 shopping center in the country, there are going to be parents who are going to say, sorry, I know you're 14, you can't go down to that mall by yourself anymore. Now, is that helicopter parenting, or is that something else?
Oh boy, that's parental anxiety, which we have. I think we're mostly fed a story that says life is scary for youth. We don't let kids have paper routes anymore. They don't know their neighbors. I think that we're reacting to that fear in a way that is not supported if we actually look at crime statistics and how safe our city is. So I think we're perpetuating anxiety. Anxiety is the #1 diagnosis in childhood now. And so I think we are in a fear-based culture here, just in terms of thinking our general other human man is out to get our kids. And that's not healthy. But when I think of the pampering, the protective parenting, it really is about this idea that you are not able to handle life, and so rather than preparing you for life, I'm going to protect you from life. And so we're not creating the psychological resiliency in our kids that comes from experiencing something, facing a hurdle, and realizing I overcame it. A lot of those kids went to that food court, a terrible thing happened, they're going to come home and say, wow, that was really scary, but you know what, I'm actually still here.
Mm-hmm. Amy, I wonder if you could help us out on that one as well. This, in case you didn't hear about it, there was a shooting at the Eaton Center in downtown Toronto, which is frankly the #1 tourist attraction in the whole country. And one person was killed. There was a 13-year-old kid who was injured. There were other, there's a pregnant woman who was trampled, and she went into premature labor as a result
yes,
of that?
which was then halted, I understand.
Which then halted,
yeah.
okay. Anyway, how much of this fear of crime is behind perhaps the hyper-parenting or the helicopter parenting, Amy, that we read so much about nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a big part of it, and I agree with Allison, there's been a real shift in the last, probably 30 years or more in terms of how much crime is reported, and, this phenomenon of missing children being reported on the news, having their faces on milk cartons and so on. That's all a relatively recent development, and I think it has fed the anxiety that has increased attachment parenting, or at least not attachment parenting, but the helicopter style, the sort of overly involved style of parenting as kids get older, particularly. I mean, the other thing, though, that I would point out that I think is really important to keep in mind is what a class and educational group-specific phenomenon this really is. And I think this is one of perhaps another reason that the conflict, the mommy wars, when it flares up, becomes so heated, because it's very tightly bound up with things like social class and educational level and where you live, and it can't really be separated from those things. So, this very over-involved style of parenting, exclusive breastfeeding until the child is 2 or 3, co-sleeping, wearing your baby, and then keeping track of all of their play dates and allergist appointments and after school activities and so on, is a full-time job. And very many women and men cannot afford to devote that much time to it, even if they only have 2 children. They have to work outside the home full-time in order to make ends meet. And in a lot of families, both parents have to do that. So I think it's important to keep in mind to what extent this phenomenon of, the "are you mom enough" phenomenon is a very class-segmented phenomenon in North America.
Mm-hmm. But Meredith, if you overheard one parent saying to their child, "You know what, Toronto is still, statistically speaking, an incredibly safe city. This was a freak occurrence that took place. You really don't have to change your behavior at all, and if you want to go for lunch in the lunch court tomorrow, it's fine with me." Would you scratch your head if somebody gave that advice, even though it might, logic tells you that's actually probably what's going to happen going forward? But would you criticize somebody who gave that advice to their child?
Oh, I certainly wouldn't criticize them. And if it were my own child, and I have a 14-year-old, I would sit with her and I would get those crime statistics, or better yet, have her get them, so that she would learn what is the reality here. And I live in a small town in upstate New York. I have friends who are policemen, and when my daughter at 14 wanted to walk downtown, I just said to her, "Well, that's fine, but you have to talk to the juvenile officer, who's someone I know, and get some ideas about what to look for." And in fact, she made that phone call. The officer told her she shouldn't be on her cell phone, she should not be texting, keep an eye out, stay away from high bushes. If she was at all nervous, then make a call or walk in the middle of the street. Common sense sorts of things. And I think that's one of the things that helicopter parenting takes away, is what's common sense. And if you can talk with your kid and educate them about common sense, then you have to really let them go and experience something. And it's a scary feeling, especially when you only have one, that, it must be some horrible risk. But I got to tell you, I have a friend whose 2 sons are now grown, launched, I guess would be the right word. And she said to me recently, "I don't know why I worried so much."
Well, there is that expression, 90% of what you worry about in life never happens. Of course, it's the other 10% that we do get concerned about. But Meredith, that seems like a very mature approach to take to parenting. And I wonder, did that come from you innately, or did you get that from your own mother?
No, not from my mother. I grew up in the 50s. From my mother, we got "go outside and play." No, it wasn't like that. And I think we're very influenced by the media, by television especially, and online, where we're getting barraged by, as one of the guests said, about, kidnapped children And when in fact the statistics show that it is no different than it was in the 50s. As a matter of fact, it's a little better now. But we have that in a very sensational sort of way, and you can't, as a parent, help but be affected by that. So one has to calm oneself down and say, wait a minute, what is the reality here? What are the real safety issues? The real safety issues, at least for teenagers, driving drunk, and that sort of thing. Those are real things, and filter that out from what feels like a craziness about parenting.
Allison, we've been talking about the impact of all of this on the children, but I want to ask you about the impact of smothering parenting or helicopter parenting on the mom.
Well, I think it's a little self-indulgent, frankly, in the sense that it does feed the notion of what's my role, what's my importance, this adds meaning to my life, and therefore it's my job description. So I had a baby because I wanted to dress them up, and I wanted to pick your clothes, and I wanted to follow you everywhere. And if you didn't need those things, then I would be unimportant. I would be out of a job. And so I think there is some of our own self-interest in some of this pampering as well. And we have to realize, you know, we do need to fire ourselves from this job and find some other substantial way to validate ourselves and our worth.
Well, that's neat. Whose job is it to tell the mother who is suffering from all of that you need to be fired?
Well, it often comes out when people come to one of my talks or to a parenting class where, and I say this quite honestly, they really are very well intentioned, and it often has not dawned on them that the methodologies of being hypervigilant could have a negative effect. Often when you point out to them that a child who is does not learn how to survey a street to look for what might seem odd, like high bushes or someone lurking, that they're actually at a greater risk for potential problems in life because they haven't learned how to look for red flags because you've always been looking for them, then you're actually hurting their development. And as soon as you say that hurts their development, oh, I don't want to be that kind of mom. And so we need to remind them that, you know how you learn how little rubber shoes, when they have dew on them, slip on the bottom rung of the climber in the park? You learn that from slipping. You don't learn it because someone stops you and says, be careful every time. And so I find a little education goes a long way in helping these people see another way. I really don't think any parent is ill-intentioned in this regard.
You all know Lisa Belkin, and she wrote a piece for the New York Times Magazine many years ago that I want to quote from now, and then we'll chat about that. Wander into any Starbucks, in any Starbucks kind of neighborhood, in the hours after the commuters are gone. See all those mothers drinking coffee and watching over toddlers at play? If you look past the Lycra gym clothes and the internet access cell phones, the scene could be the 50s, but for the fact that the coffee is more expensive and the mothers have MBAs. We've gotten so used to the sight that we've lost track of the fact that this was not the way it was supposed to be. Women, specifically educated professional women, were supposed to achieve like men. Once the barriers came down, once the playing field was leveled, they were supposed to march towards the future and take rightful ownership of the universe, or at the very least, ownership of their half. The women's movement was largely about grabbing a fair share of power, making equal money, standing at the helm in the macho realms of business and government and law. It was about running the world. Amy, my question is, why did these women opt out of that vision?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I have discussed Lisa Belkin's article with my students when it first came out several years ago, and it was a very interesting conversation because, of course, many of them, my students at Dartmouth are all very ambitious, very successful, difficult college to get into, and so they've all worked very hard to get there, and many of them are taking ambitious programs of study and so on. But this idea that they might work for a few years and then after they'd established themselves a little bit, quit their career in order to have children was very compelling to them. And I think one of the reasons for that is that there's a kind of a post-feminist discourse that a lot of this, that generation of young women has bought into, that says that feminism is really all about choice and that that's the most important thing. And I think, as Lisa Belkin explains in that quote you just read, that feminism isn't just about choice, it's partly about that, but it's also about a critique of a certain set of power relations. And so it's not just about valorizing whatever choices happen to be made. That said, of course, it's good for women to have choices, better than if they don't, I think. But I don't think that that's enough. And the other thing I would say is that, one of the reasons I think for opting out is just how incredibly difficult it is to combine a demanding professional career with raising children. And I think this is an institutional problem that many women find themselves kind of beating their heads against a brick wall, and they think, why do that? Why not actually put my energy where I feel like I'm going to be effective? And, I only will have one chance to raise my children, and I want to do it the right way. And I think that's not an irrational decision in a world where it's very difficult to combine a demanding career with and being an involved parent.
Now, Meredith, Lisa wrote that piece almost a decade ago. So a decade later, how do you think that choice to opt out is looking to women who are, say, in their early 30s now?
I think the choice to opt out is a socioeconomic one, a class one, because those women at Starbucks who were there 10 years ago and who are there today, they have a partner who is out working and making money so that they can do that. And with the economic squeeze, that happens less often. People who do decide not, women who decide not to work, have someone who's doing that, or they've made the choice to have fewer things in life or things that aren't as expensive. But one thing we haven't looked at is the high number and growing number of single mother parents. And that's a phenomenon where women need to work, or they're getting outside help financially. They're also taking care of the kids. And I think that's part of the new social phenomenon of the mommy wars. Where do they fit in all of this? Because they're by themselves doing, trying to be, maybe they're trying to be a helicopter mother and work at the same time. Where are the men in all this? Why aren't we talking about them?
That's, you just raised two great questions there. Let me see if I can follow up on this. The first one, this is the so-called Murphy-Brown phenomenon, right? Which Dan Quayle railed against, I guess, well, it's 20 years now, I guess, that he started to rail against that. Where are they in all of this Murphy-Brown phenomenon of single women who want to have their children and somehow are going to be there for that kid and make a living? And, I mean, boy, oh boy, I don't know how they do it all.
Yeah, they're the unsung heroes, and those numbers are growing all the time. And I think this goes back to the conversation about the institutions in the different countries and who supports what. I remember quite a few years ago seeing a really powerful documentary following a single mother in Germany versus a single mother in America. And in Germany, because of their institutions, she was allowed to still, take time off work and coach Little League and, cook homemade dinners and work on homework and had a regular day. And the American mother had to work 2 jobs, was commuting by subway. You could see the stress doing laundry at 1 o'clock in the morning, just simply because they didn't have the same social support networks there. So it is, to me, we have to decide as a culture, do we value childhood? If we do, then let's put the dollars behind it. We have the money, we decide what we're going to support. Actually, one of my favorite little posters is, won't it be a great day when the all nursery schools are fully funded and the Navy has to hold a bake sale in order to buy a new submarine? Right? I mean, really, why are we out there selling, cookie dough and wrapping paper for our kids to have a few things in life? Come on. This is faulty societal values, in my opinion.
Well, if Eric Margulies were here, formerly of the Toronto Sun, he'd be saying that's all well and good until somebody wants to, take a submarine across that Atlantic Ocean and invade your country. Then you need a Navy.
I'm saying it's a choice, and other cultures make it work, and we could certainly step up.
Gotcha. All right. Well, you know what? Meredith also asked that question about where are the men. And Amy, let me put that to you. In this mommy wars scenario, it really is, it seems, all about the women. Where are the men in these mommy wars?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. One of the criticisms of attachment parenting, at least the latest sort of dispute about it that I've read that's been most interesting, is that it really pushes men to the sidelines, and that the idea of attachment parenting is something of a misnomer because it's really about attachment mothering. I mean, particularly when you look at the early childhood where, the focus is on breastfeeding, so much, and that's a job that only women can do. So it really ends up kind of sidelining fathers, and I think that's a real problem because in terms of thinking about how women might be able to combine work and family, obviously the support of fathers or other parents is essential, and not everyone has a partner to parent with, of course. So that's a place where we need to have better societal institutions to step in and help out. But the other thing that I wanted to go back to, which Meredith mentioned about the way that economics plays into this, that I think is really important, is that it's not just that fewer women will be able to opt out in tough economic times such as we're experiencing now, but also that opting out puts them in a really economically vulnerable position. And this is something that I try to emphasize with my students when we discuss this this choice that many of them were interested in making. That one thing they don't realize is to what extent there are long-term repercussions of stepping out of the workforce for a long period of time, that it's very difficult to get back in, and that you could become economically dependent upon your partner in a way that, as long as the marriage survives, is perfectly, maybe perfectly okay, but if the marriage doesn't survive, can be very difficult. And this is one reason that we see so many women economically worse off after divorce than men.
Allison, you wanted to follow?
Mm-hmm. Well, as much as we've tried to improve gender relations, I still think you will see that for a man to feel his sense of manhood, he needs to protect and provide. So if you want a man to fall into a deep depression, have him lose his job. Women, we still have the gender belief that we are to nurture and care for. And so motherhood becomes our prime directive. And if we fail at motherhood, that is the thing that will plummet our self-worth. So I think that there is still a duality there, even though we try to level the playing field. So motherhood still falls into that reign where I'm still supposed to bring in an income because I'm told I have opportunities in the workplace, but I cannot falter in my motherhood role. So I think we really are doing double duty.
We are partly doing this program today because of something we're playing on TVO later tonight. The Slap. It's a miniseries I suspect many of you have heard about. It's from Australia, and it is based on the best-selling book. 10 p.m. TVO tonight. We run the first edition, and here's an excerpt. Roll tape, please.
No one deserves to be hit, Anouk, let alone a child.
Well, we all wanted to slap Hugo that day.
Well, that's a horrible thing to say.
Well, and it's not horrible that she might ruin Harry and Sandy's lives just because Gary always has to be the victim.
Just shut it.
Or is it
Anouk.
that he's bored? Is that it, Rosie? Gary's just feeling a bit bored. He wants a bit of drama in his life. Hugo's problem is not that Harry gave him a slap. Hugo's problem is that you and Gary let him act like an absolute brat.
That's enough.
I have never seen you discipline him. You never give him any boundaries, and he's learned he can act like a total monster and
That's
get
enough.
away with it.
You know, you've never been interested in our children. You made that clear over the years, so don't assume you can start being an authority now.
Yeah. What do I know about kids?
Meredith, I have to tell you, that is not a conversation that I have ever heard any group of men have. Why do women get so judgmental when they're in those kinds of circumstances?
It is pretty amazing, isn't it? Well, the idea that women are always nice and that they're always supportive of each other is simply not true. You have some women friends or family members who are very supportive, but women are incredibly competitive, and I won't go into it now, but it makes some evolutionary sense, and protective of their families, and it's pretty common. I mean, you just have to watch any reality show and you'll see that. So it makes sense to me. Just that because the men aren't having that conversation doesn't mean they aren't thinking about it.
Yeah, I think it probably does, actually. Listen, what do I know? But my hunch is I don't even think men think about those conversations too much. I mean, feel free to email me if I'm completely off base on this. But Amy, this seems to be, within the province, 99% of women, that kind of scene. How come?
Well, I mean, I think Allison just said it, that it is still the case, no matter, what kind of gains the feminist movement has made and how many women have entered the workforce. I think that women tend to identify themselves more with the role of a mother and men tend to identify themselves more in terms of their career. And so I think that there's, for women, a huge amount of anxiety, and also for working mothers, a huge amount of guilt, actually, about, huge internal conflict, as it were, about whether they're being selfish for pursuing their career and spending, evenings at the office, or missing birthday parties to go to a conference, or whatever it might be. And that kind of internal conflict then easily gets, projected outward onto other people who do it differently. And, the sense that someone else might be judging you can make you kind of lash out.
Gotcha. Allison, we got about a minute left here, and I want to read this from Eilette Waldman from the New York Times of a couple of years ago and have you react to it. However, she says, there's no denying that a current of sanctimony and even vitriol runs through the waters of contemporary motherhood. While the urge to paint one another as bad mothers has always been there, it seems worse now than ever. I wonder if this is not because mothers today are of the first generation raised in a post-feminist world. What do you think?
Well, my take on it is that the cost that you pay when you achieve a certain social equality is that you look for new ways to be superior. And our new way to be superior is to be right. And I think that's where the sanctimonious attitude is coming. And it also helps define our tribe. If I'm going to know who I am and who I belong to, I have to know the difference between you and me. But I can't just embrace it as different. I have to know what it is, define it, be a part of it, find my social belonging, and then say, and I'm better than you.
And just in our last 10 seconds here, any chance this pendulum is going to swing back at some point?
I think that's the good news about all of this. Yeah. I mean, really, when we get this crazy and neurotic about parenting, and we have this kind of outcome with our children, it tells me that we've got to start correcting now. Okay. So yay.
We'll be on the look for that and have you all back and discuss that. Can I thank all three of you for joining us on the program tonight. Amy Allen from Dartmouth College, who's over in Frankfurt, Germany. Amy, thanks, and we're so glad that the Skype held up. Worked very well. Meredith Small, Cornell University. She was on the line from Ithaca, New York. And Allison Schaefer, author of Ain't Misbehavin', here in our Toronto studios. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.